This is Tony Parker. This is Tony Parker's 17-season career as a San Antonio Spur. Over that span, Parker earned 6 All-Star selections and won 4 NBA titles, plus a Finals MVP trophy. Since retirement, Parker has been immortalized in the San Antonio rafters and in the Hall of Fame. Tony Parker is a Spurs legend. This is Stephen Jackson. Here's his time in San Antonio. Jackson's good but sub-All-Star career included 2 separate stints in San Antonio with Parker, toward the beginning and again near the end. Jackson got 1 early ring, but he is not a Spurs legend. Tony Parker doesn't say much about Stephen Jackson. Stephen Jackson says a lot about Tony Parker, and it's all pretty nasty. So let's figure out what's going on here. Hey, real quick, check out our Patreon if you want more secret-based stuff. Extended stuff, exclusive stuff, secret stuff, stuff in advance, all kinds of stuff, and a lot of it. Stephen Jackson retired in 2014, but he kept working in the public eye with plenty of TV and podcast appearances to his name, including his own show with Matt Barnes. Tony Parker retired in 2019, and he has spent much less time since then in front of a camera and microphone, at least in the US. This imbalance is crucial. Jackson talks more often and more candidly than Parker, and he began doing so while Parker was still in the league. Still, when Jackson speaks spicily, he's almost always talking about the past. This isn't about Parker as a man, but about him as a teammate, about their 2 stints playing basketball together. So let's visit those stints, through Jackson's words and through our own observation. Parker and Jackson arrived in San Antonio at the same time, 2001, but from different directions. Here's Jackson's version of a Tony Parker biography from an episode of his show in 2023.
He's very selfish. He's been selfish. We would have had more championships and more success if it wasn't for him being so selfish. But he was told as a 16, 17-year-old in France that he was this.
That's a lot. So here's what we know to be true about Parker's path to the NBA that might help us appraise the stuff about selfishness and hypothetical championships. Parker turned pro in France when he was just 17, and he decided to remain a pro rather than play college ball in the US. At 19, Parker entered the 2001 NBA draft, and San Antonio took a swing on the relatively unknown point guard with the 28th pick. The selection was controversial, even within the organization, and it puzzled outside observers. Yes, it used to be weird for an NBA player to come from France. That same 01 offseason, the Spurs added Stephen Jackson. His path was different. Jackson had been one of the best high school wings in the country, but he couldn't play college ball for academic reasons. Jackson went in the second round of the 97 draft, failed to stick on several NBA rosters, toiled in middling leagues on multiple continents, then finally got a steady gig with the 01 New Jersey Nets, only to fall out of favor by season's end. Anyway, the Spurs signed Jackson that summer just to fill out their training camp roster. The 23-year-old made the team, which was a promising development, but he received sparse bench minutes while the teenaged Parker became a starter and ran with the big dogs basically right away. Now, the gap between Jackson and Parker narrowed in year 2. Parker continued his gradual trajectory towards stardom, and Jackson suddenly rocketed up the depth chart right beside him. Jackson's temperamental play always kind of clashed with stern Spurs coach Greg Popovich, but Stack Jack could really get buckets. His scoring talent eventually won out over his unpredictability. With veteran wing Steve Smith slowing down, Popovich moved Jackson into the starting lineup. He became San Antonio's 3rd option beside Parker and centerpiece Tim Duncan. And Jackson kept that role throughout the season and into the 2003 playoffs, playing a critical part in San Antonio's march through the Western Conference bracket, then logging a few standout shooting performances in a finals victory over the New Jersey Nets. But what about Tony? Here's where we should hear from Jackson, decades later, then check his beefy words against the facts. Take it away, Stephen, again from that 2023 episode of his show, All the Smoke.
He had a rude awakening because once we got to the playoffs, it was Stephon Marbury, it was Jason Kidd. He couldn't handle him, so we had to pay Speedy Claxton. So I know the real Tony. You know what I'm saying? He can fool everybody else, but he is one of the most selfish players I've ever played with.
This isn't the only time Jackson roasted Parker's performance in the 2003 playoffs and credited Speedy Claxton instead. He did the same thing when talking on Paul Pierce and Kevin Garnett's show. So let's dig in. Did Tony Parker get cooked? Yeah, kinda. 2002-03 was a bad defensive year for him by basically any metric. He was 20, after all, and pretty small even for a point guard. In the playoffs, Stephon Marbury and Jason Kidd did indeed fry him sometimes. The most egregious example was Marbury outscoring Parker 32-2 in Game 2 of the Spurs-Suns series. And Kidd had a couple big nights in the Spurs-Nets finals. But again, we're talking about a guy who turned 21 that May, who was battling veteran, big-bodied all-stars. And that 21-year-old returned the favor with some impressive performances of his own. The idea that backup point guard Speedy Claxton routinely took Parker's place in the fourth quarters of games that season just isn't accurate. But there are a couple big data points that must stick out in Jackson's recollection. In Game 4 of the 2003 finals, Tony Parker shot a dreadful 1 of 10 in the first half while the Spurs fell behind double digits. Claxton checked in early in the third quarter and ignited a rally, only for Parker to return in the fourth and continue struggling. The Nets staved off San Antonio's comeback, and they won Game 4. In Game 6, one win away from a title, Parker again failed to get it going. This time, Pop stuck with the backup. Claxton replaced Parker in the middle of the third quarter and then played the entire fourth. So when the buzzer sounded on his first career championship, Tony Parker was on the bench. Speedy Claxton did kinda save the Spurs in this instance. That certainly made Speedy a folk hero, and it made Tony look overmatched, befitting his inexperience. Selfish? I don't know. But this much is clear. Both of Tim Duncan's young sidekicks had reason to feel alienated the summer after their first championship. For Jackson, it was an uncertain free agency. He had been at odds with Coach Popovich, and he became disturbed by the front office acquiring a couple players who shared his position. So rather than return to San Antonio, Jackson accepted a shorter, much less lucrative deal with the Atlanta Hawks, and the rest is history. Hawks, Pacers, Malice at the Palace, We Believe Warriors, etc. Very good career with some major headaches. Back to 2003. Parker was under contract that summer, but he had been hearing rumors for a while that the Spurs would try to replace him by signing his finals opponent. And indeed, after Parker looked overwhelmed for parts of the finals, the Spurs very nearly came to terms with Jason Kidd. The interest alone represented kind of an insult to the young Parker. San Antonio actually acquiring Kidd would have dramatically altered Parker's developmental trajectory. In the end, Kidd changed his mind and remained a Net, a decision that haunted him and behooved Parker. Tony kept his spot, and the rest is history. Multiple All-Star appearances, more rings, eternal honor in San Antonio as part of this triumvirate. Yes, Tim, Tony, and Steven got the Spurs one ring. Tim, Tony, and Manu got the Spurs a bunch more. Here is another element of our beef. In 2003, Manu Ginobili was just a 25-year-old rookie from Argentina playing a relatively small role in the Spurs rotation. Ginobili didn't break out as a star until after Steven Jackson left, but Jackson felt like the machinations started earlier, like Parker was trying to pull the strings. And to be clear, Jackson doesn't blame Manu for that at all.
Ginobili was totally different. As far as a teammate, that's definitely one of the best teammates I've ever had in my life.
This part of our beef can't really be confirmed or denied. We know Parker and Ginobili were already familiar from their concurrent careers in Europe, and we know they became close friends over time, but no one else confirms Jackson's accusations that Tony was pulling for Manu the whole time. And nobody said anything of the sort at the time, including Jackson after he returned to San Antonio as an opponent. If anything, Jackson regretted leaving. If that was the end of the relationship, if they had stayed separate, maybe we would have never heard about a Jackson-Parker beef, and that's how it was for almost a decade. But then they reunited. Right before the 2012 trade deadline, the Spurs made a pretty shocking deal to acquire Steven Jackson. He was back with the franchise whose offer he had spurned a decade ago, back with Popovich, and back with Parker. This was a very different dynamic from the days when Parker and Jackson were developing youngsters. Parker was now an established star in his prime, and Jackson was an aging veteran winding down his career, a bench guy. But once again, Tony's play at the end of a playoff run, a loss this time, gave Jackson more beef ammo. The 2012 Spurs made it back to the Western Conference Finals for the first time in a few years. San Antonio went up 2-0 against the upstart Oklahoma City Thunder, then lost 3 in a row, setting up a do-or-die Game 6 in OKC. Here is Jackson's recollection of that game as told to Brian Windhorst. Jackson had a hell of a game with 6 3-pointers, so did Kawhi Leonard. Tony came in and tried to save the day, and the Spurs stopped playing team ball, and that was why they lost. After the game, Popovich told Jackson, Duncan, and Leonard that he should have depended on them more, which Jackson interpreted as regret for putting Parker in the game. Okay, so this is very specific, and we can fact check. The Spurs took a big lead against the Thunder, but blew it and lost Game 6 down the stretch. Did Jackson have a hell of a Game 6? Yes, he was awesome the whole series, and he did hit 6 of 7 from downtown in that decisive game. Was rookie Kawhi Leonard playing particularly well in that game? Not really, but that's kind of an aside. The big accusation is that Tony came in the game and tried to save the day and stopped playing team ball. I went back and watched for that, and For one thing, Parker assisted half of Jackson's 3-pointers. Tony had 12 assists overall to go with 29 points on 27 shots. For another thing, Jackson himself picked up a technical foul during Game 6, literally giving a point away because he acted out in a critical game. And as for that final stint where Parker was supposedly trying to save the day, I spotted a few moments where I guess Parker looked Jackson off, like this one where Parker took it himself and scored. Here, Jackson clearly wanted the kick out but didn't get it. Worked out anyway. And here's a spot where Jackson wanted the ball entered to Duncan, but Parker kept it. Here's Jackson trying to catch a trailing 3 again, but Parker took it all the way to the rim and finished. So while Tony did indeed shoot more than anyone else down the stretch of that game, he made 3 of his 6 shots. Those shots kept the game competitive until the final seconds. The one 3-pointer Jackson took in the final seconds was an important one, and he bricked it. And then Tony bricked one as well for good measure. So sometimes you lose. Sometimes you shoot 6 for 7 from downtown and your team still loses. That sucks for Steven, but I just don't think it was Tony's fault. I'm just not convinced he deliberately avoided Jackson in this instance, and no one else has echoed Jackson's claim that Popovich blamed the loss on Parker. And then, 1 year later, the Spurs cut Jackson, right before the start of the 2013 playoffs. He had just become too much of a headache for Popovich and company again. Parker and the Spurs made the finals that season, then won it all in 2014. So Jackson missed out on his second NBA title. And thus, perhaps forever, and despite the 03 ring, Steven Jackson's opinion of the franchise is straightforward.
Fuck the Spurs, though.
Add all that up, and you could tell a simple story. Jackson felt like the Spurs didn't want him, so he left after the 03 title. Parker had his own reasons to worry about job security, but ultimately became part of a legendary dynasty. It's not hard to imagine how that difference would breed resentment. If Jackson was the only Spur to ever have a problem with Tony Parker, that simple story would be enough, but he's not. And I'm not even talking about the whole thing with Brent Barry's wife, which is only vaguely confirmed, but, it's out there. In 2018, Kawhi Leonard's lengthy injury recovery became a major story. Doubly so when Parker reportedly pushed on Leonard to return and publicly said that he had recovered from a worse version of the same injury. Jackson, now retired and making the media rounds, went on Colin Cowherd's show and issued a diagnosis as well as a prediction.
I know the type of person Tony is. He can't be selfish, and by this comment, I wouldn't be surprised if this makes Kawhi want to leave.
And, well, the prediction part of this was right. Kawhi Leonard asked out of the only team he had ever played for, the one for whom he'd won Finals MVP. And both Adrian Wojnarowski and Zach Lowe reported that Parker's comments were a motivating factor.
The last straw for him, I was told, was when Tony Parker made those comments.
Yeah, you've heard that. I've heard that. Those Tony Parker comments.
In 2023, former Spurs point guard DeJounte Murray went on All the Smoke and shared his own comparable experience with Parker as a teammate.
In my second year, they see I come back, obviously getting stronger, getting better. And then that was the year I took the job from Tony. Pop brought us in the office. You know what I mean? He told Tony ain't like it. I know he ain't like it.
You know he ain't like it.
You know what I'm saying?
That's
Like,
my
for me,
boy.
I love real. Like, keep it a buck with me.
Yeah.
Like, keep it 100, bro. I'ma love you for that. You know what I mean? And I know he didn't like it. Because if he liked it, he would have mentored me the way he should have.
Right.
He wouldn't have went to Charlotte. He would have stayed right there.
Which is to say, maybe it's not so simple. Steven Jackson has said a lot of unkind stuff about Tony Parker. Some of it is fair, some is inaccurate, some of it is hypothetical, some is unprovable. You could chalk all of the above up to envy, bad faith. But Jackson might argue he's the only one willing to speak truth to the power that is Parker's Spurs legacy. The reality probably lies somewhere in between. Whatever it is, it's beef. Hey, thank you so much for watching, and I was not kidding about that Patreon thing. All of these people could tell you. It's a lot of fun over there.